Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are located. And I'm sure that our geography is very broad. I know that there are also international speakers because Professor Colbin's conference is very relevant and has a very interesting agenda. Thank you for your kind introductory words. And today I am presenting on behalf of the Group of Russia. I represent the Union of Pediatricians of Russia, and I would like to share with you what is happening in pediatric routine practice and what does it have with RWD, RWE. It is open secret that only lazy people are loath to say about 4P medicine. And we thought, well, what about pediatrics? Is there 4P in pediatrics, or maybe more P's than needed? Well, of course, as for programming of the children's health within the 1,000 first days of life, well, has been determined by the global concept of the WHO, child and maternal care programs in Russia. In 2017, there was the order of the president of the Russian Federation, number 240, on the decade of childhood in the Russian Federation from 2018 to 2027. And of course, that means that we needed to include the different aspects here: cognitive health, well, genetic aspects of health, well, intellectual health, issues related to prevention of different diseases that can lead to disabilities, to different chronic diseases, and the need for their treatment. In fact, what can we say about our pediatric routine practice? Is there any connection between RWD, RWE, and pediatric treatment? Well, unfortunately, we still have a limited access to modern drugs. I mean, children have very limited access to modern drugs. Also, there is the use of off-label drugs en masse, unfortunately, and it's very difficult to cope with this problem because this runs counter our guidelines. And of course, in fact, we do not have enough epidemiological data and evidence-based data regarding the efficacy and safety of specific drugs intended for children. Well, of course, the use of off-label drugs in pediatrics can be a serious problem, although there are voices for and there are voices against the off-label drugs in pediatrics. As for those who are for the use of off-label drugs in pediatrics, say that these drugs are innovative, these are high-quality drugs. Of course, those who are for that say will allow us to improve the quality of medical care in general, and they give access to modern heights in science. But on the other hand, well, we understand that we are responsible for different predictions of adverse reactions when off-label drugs are used. Well, of course, especially long-term perspectives of such adverse reactions in children. That's the concern of parents. 14 years ago, there were major events that happened in the world. First of all, the pediatric regulations changed. In fact, there was the amendment of different documents in the United States, in the EU, and in Japan, in Canada, and because of the pediatric regulation that entered into force in 2007, there was a new way for the development of drugs for this category of patients. Any drug launched on the market, even before that, when the master file is sent for registration, this master file should contained a list of different documents, including the mandatory plan of pediatric studies, and launching a new drug on the market must open access to this drug not only for adults but also for children as well. And sometimes in the past there was a gap in children's access to this particular drug as compared to adults, which resulted in sometimes even several decades. And at that time, and I made a presentation during that discussion, well, it was quite obvious that there was the improvement of the situation because the master file was supposed to contain even pediatric trials. In 2017. There was a report on this issue stipulating that more drugs are being used on children. So children have a better access to such drugs, especially in rheumatology and in case of communicable diseases. But unfortunately, the progress was not quite significant. Well, usually when there is a drug, well, it can be used on children and adults, but the course of the disease in children is different as compared to adults. And of course, the children's market is totally different from the adults market. Right now, we can see that there is a reduction in the number of children in population. There is an increase of the number of adults over 65 and over 80. Well, we can see that in developed countries, well, the number of the elderly is much higher than the number of adults and adolescents and children. That is why EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and the Pediatric Committee develop an action plan to improve this situation related to the pediatric regulation of the United States did not stand alone. Here is the publication of 2019 when the United States conducted a retrospective cohort study, and you can see that in the Pediatric Health Information System office assessed the provision of care for more than 6 million children at different stages. This was done only in 2014, 7 years after the introduction of this pediatric regulation. And this publication of 2019 described the situation in 2014. As for off-label drugs, the situation is quite obvious. And usually these are drugs to treat the central nervous system, the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, the GI, and some other diseases, including antimicrobial drugs, as well as, hormonal drugs, electrolytes, etc. Well, this analysis showed that there was some positive changes in terms of the use of the pediatric regulation, in particular, as far as some pediatric drugs are concerned. Well, they should undergo the specific studies of safety and tolerance, but even at that time, well, off-label drugs were administered to children en masse. Every fourth children got an off-label drug at that time. And this problem has become important when we started preparing our guidelines, because in Russia, there is a need to provide additional substantiation of using an off-label drug in clinical guidelines, and it's a time-consuming process when we try to find some additional evidence of the safety of a specific dose or a specific regimen with this drug when it is administered to a child. Another serious challenge was the lack of off-label drugs in standard of care. They're not included because if an off-label drug is included in the standard of care, that means that the healthcare facility can provide a cheaper treatment for children. Of course, we've been trying to do everything possible to change the situation. We provide our justification, we provide evidence to include, off-label drugs in clinical recommendations. While we analyze the instructions of FDA and EMA, we study the results published in other countries, the results of the clinical trials, and of course, we will look at foreign clinical guidelines and protocols. But one of the major problems is that we don't have enough evidence obtained here inside the Russian Federation as far as these issues are concerned. And of course, the lack of these clinical trials data on children means that there is I need to do something to find RWD, RWE data. And of course, that's what is the subject of this conference. The problems shown here on the slide can be referred also to clinical trials as well. And obviously, there will be now in any trial an RWD section. Each article published in the journal will mention RWD, for example, saying that there were some problems with the design of the study when it was impossible to develop the design in such a way so that it could include a larger number of patients, but it's impossible because of the rare disease. Also, there are some problems related to the unification of patients depending on the course of the disease. All patients are different, and that's one of the major problems which for P medicine defines. On the one hand, we should use evidence-based data, which can be obtained only on large populations, but at the same time, we should remember about the individual life and health of every patient, and that means a personalized medicine. Pharmaceutical companies, are not quite interested in that because of the low commercialization. The market of drugs for children is much smaller than the one for adults. And obviously, in speaking of the gold standard, we're talking about randomized clinical trials, and RWD will be used in addition to them. Here you can see the quality of randomized observational trials. Yes, there is a risk of mistakes as we develop the design of a particular study. There are also contradictions when, for example, heterogeneity is not taken into account as we develop the design of the study. There are also some other difficulties related to extrapolation when we have a lot of different lab trials and the results are difficult to extrapolate to the population at large. Well, there might be some bias, and there could be the difference in results obtained. Well, finally, there might be publication errors and factors that can improve the quality of evidence in observational studies. Well, those effective dependence, the power of the study, they can be applicable to other forms of studies as well. So as of today, RWD, RWE can be the only sources of evidence and thus the major instruments in decision making. Well, when we expand the registries, when we add more data and when we analyze the data stored in these registries, also we can use the databases of different healthcare facilities and different medical organizations, for example, such as Uniform State Health Information System or others. Here there is one big problem. All these databases are not synchronized with one another. So often it's difficult to make a comparison of data between different databases, and sometimes it's difficult to say whether the data are complete. Well, we can also distribute questionnaires among patients, although that's not a very objective method to analyze some specific data, but even this method can be taken into account. And finally, well, the use of electronic diaries, different mobile applications, and bots. For example, bots are gaining momentum, and later I will show you some examples here. That is why the RWD instruments are quite prospective, because they allow us to obtain and analyze the data, well, also long-term data, and do a retrospective analysis to assess the results of specific clinical situations, to assess the course of the disease in real patients, which go beyond the protocol when we do a similar thing in randomized clinical trials, where RWD can allow us to assess the results of specific clinical situations, especially the quality of life of specific patients, and identify the strategies for patient management in such cases. So the right collection of RWD will allow us to improve the quality of care. And I should say that RWD, RWE, well, have already become a norm in developing guidelines, and right now there are updated FDA guidelines on RWD, RWE. EMA is also actively using RWD instruments in the process of decision making. For us, for the Association of Russian Pediatricians, RWD also play a very important role in the decision-making process. Well, here you can see the ERS data, and you can see that the picture is nice, and well, basically you can see that we are trying to use a similar approach when after, well, the question has been formulated, then we identify the process, we use the grade, the process for analysis, then evidence is being selected for the process of decision making, and then, well, after we select outcomes and evidence to decision process, the recommendations or guidelines are formulated for or against an intervention, and maybe strong or conditional or weak, depending on the situation. But that allows us to make us a specific decision. Here is one of the publications of last year, which describes how real-world evidence can be used to assess medication safety or effectiveness in children. And the authors of this systemic review encountered the following situation. They studied 29 trials. Well, and these are real-world data used to assess the efficacy and safety of drugs on children. And I had a discussion with different people, including the discussion in mass media. Well, for children, the question of safety always ranks first. So all our studies should be aimed at confirming safety first, and then the effectiveness of a particular drug. Well, out of 915, well, 29 studies were selected for further analysis, because like in systemic reviews, these studies were not homogeneous in terms of the groups of patients or conditions or drugs or design or the sources of data and methodological strictness. Again, the evidence obtained was not complete according to FDA criteria to analyze safety or effectiveness of specific drugs. Let me just briefly inform you about our modest experience. I should say that in the very beginning of our work, we used RWD, RWE instruments to analyze the children's data. These are children with allergy. And you can see the results of the work of the chat bot, MedQuizBot. And I should say that 68 patients took part in this study that was done in the online mode. And you can see that MedQuizBot basically collected and analyzed data in order to provide help with patients with allergies. Well, and all patients got a reminder of the need to be on basic therapy. And you can see that MedQuizBot automatically gathered and analyzed the data every 4 weeks. The data were provided as part of the asthma control test program. There were also daily reminders about the need to take the basic therapy. And again, you can see that MedQuizBot better helped to control asthma in children according to parents' polls. And well, 92% would like to use MedQuizBot in the future. So parents in particular assessed the convenience of using MedQuizBot as compared to other sources. And this happened during the pandemic, during the lockout that we had in our country because of the COVID-19. Also in the summer, well, that was the pollen season, and children had problems here. So this mobile system allowed us to maintain the connection with the patients even during the lockdown and send them reminders about the proper use of drugs. Well, of course, our proposals are quite obvious to support such instruments related to gathering RWD or RWE because they are aimed at optimizing the pharmacotherapy of children, well, with rare nosologies and also with widespread diseases. Well, the drug developer, as it conducts the study, should also take into account the interests of children. Well, for example, right now we can see that as for the Pfizer vaccine, studies were conducted, and now, well, children over 16 can be immunized with Pfizer. Now children over 12. So right now, 3/4 of children have gotten the vaccine against the coronavirus. In Russia, only one vaccine has been undergoing clinical trials. For that, of course, there is also need to standardize the mechanism of including RWD in clinical guidelines so that off-label drugs could also be used in such situations on the basis of their true cost and to develop a mechanism to identify different differences and inconsistency of results. So right now, as for The future of medicine, it lies in precision medicine, especially in pediatrics. And first and foremost, well, medicine should improve health of our patients. Thank you very much.